What's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. So as you probably see by the description of this video, this is going to be a buyer's guide. I own a BMW E46. I've owned a few of them. I've owned quite a few other BMWs, so I have a lot of knowledge. I have a lot of experience working at BMW dealerships, a lot of BMW training. So I'm very familiar with these cars. This guide is going to be going over the common issues that these cars have, being old and higher mileage, the things you need to be looking for if you're looking to buy one, the things you need to look for or be watchful for if you already own one. So this is an E46 chassis that we're going to be dealing with today. That runs from 99 through 05. 04 was the last year for sedans and wagons, and then the coupes and convertibles carry over for a year while the new sedan and wagon of the new chassis is out. So if you're dealing with a coupe or convertible, it can be up to an 05. Everything else, this is going to be up until 04. So we're just going to go, like I said, we're just going to go over the few things that these cars are notorious for. This car actually doesn't have a whole lot of problems, so I'm not going to be able to show you like visual examples. I'll put pictures in the videos for the things that I'm talking about, but I'm going to show you guys what to look for. So let's get to it. All right, so the first thing we're going to go over is probably the most obvious if you are involved in the BMW community, know anybody that owns one, own one yourself at this point, and are just watching this video so you get some more information. BMWs are notorious, especially older ones, for oil leaks. That's going to be the first thing we go over today, just because it's the most common thing. It happens on a regular basis. What I've experienced is that you are probably about every 2 to 4 years, even if you're owning one and maintaining it yourself, are probably going to end up having an oil leak. They kind of go in rotation with each other, so it's just part of owning them. If you're watching this channel, you either are buying one to work on it yourself or are, just trying to gain information. It's a lot easier to work on this stuff yourself. These cars are not crazy complicated to work on. I provide a lot of information on them, so if you haven't, please go check out my videos. These cars have 3 main areas where they leak oil from. You're going to be valve cover, oil filter housing, and then the oil pan gasket. Those are what we call in the BMW world is the trifecta. Some cars that you deal with will have all 3. Some cars will have 1. Some cars will have 2. It's just different. It's hit or miss. You fix it. You fix one, and sometimes you fix the one leak and another one comes up a couple months later. It's just kind of part of BMW ownership. A lot of times once you get all of them kind of straightened out, you got a couple years of being okay before one of them will start leaking again. It realistically is just part of BMW ownership. It's part of German car ownership. Let's be real. It's an industry known thing that BMWs and German cars in general have oil leak problems. Just pre-warning you guys before you buy one. It's part of life. So I'm going to go over showing you guys where to look on these cars. So 3 series, you have your oil filter cap, an oil filter here. This is actually oil filter cartridge, oil cap, and your valve cover. The most common area that you're going to see the valve cover leak from is back here in the back corner. You will see leaking or staining on the back corner back there, as well as like road grime and stuff stuck in the oil leak along this side. If the oil leak is bad enough, you will see it where it's dripping down onto the exhaust manifold on this side and can be smoking, hissing, all kinds of things. I've seen pretty bad oil leaks before, so just letting you guys know, sometimes they're super obvious, sometimes they're not. The next one is going to be your oil filter housing. Now, your oil filter housing is not just this piece up top. It actually runs down the entire side of the engine. I will actually put a picture of one here in the video. And there's a gasket on that oil filter housing that allows oil to flow from the engine block in through the oil filter, and then through the filter, and then back into the engine block. So that gasket between this housing and the engine gets hard and brittle over time and leaks. It's relatively difficult to try to find out if it's leaking from up top here. You can usually look in down here in between the intake manifold itself and the oil filter cartridge cap and see moisture and oil buildup down underneath there. You can look from either in between here or over here on the air filter side in this general area here and see down in there and see oil. It'll pool in the side of the engine block and then run down onto the ground. This is kind of another oil leak area, but to me it goes with the oil filter housing, is this oil Vanos line right here runs from this variable valve timing actuator up top here around the back and bolts into the back of the oil filter housing. That oil line has a tendency to leak too. Most of the time you're going to see it down there, and it could either be one or the other, but you're going to cover both repairs at the same time. You're not going to replace that oil line and then just assume that that fixed the problem, because the amount of time it takes you to get down in there is almost exactly the same. So they kind of go hand in hand. That's why that's not a separate concern. And then the next thing is going to be your oil pan gasket. So we're going to go underneath the car, and I'm going to point out to you guys there where those leak from. All right, so rolling underneath the car, you're gonna have, most of the time, some of them don't, you're gonna have a splash shield up here in the front that kind of catches things from the engine / keeps things from going up in the engine bay. It makes it a little difficult to inspect things, but if you're able to like crawl around underneath the ground on the car that you're looking at, and this is in the way, you can still look at some of the oil pan leak issues. So we're gonna roll to the back here. This is backed by the control arms. So this is your tire area here coming over. You're gonna have an opening here in this pan, or in this metal subframe. Well, this is actually considered a subframe brace, but this metal pan underneath the back part of the engine. Sometimes there's a cover here, sometimes there's not. Obviously mine doesn't have it, but this is your oil pan right here. This is your drain plug bolt for your oil. Normally, if you have an oil leak, you're going to see it, and I actually have a little bit of one here. I don't believe this is actually oil pan. This is a transmission leak that I have, but it'll kind of look like staining here on the pan like this does, as well as in this back corner back here of the oil pan, you'll see staining between the oil pan and the block. This whole passenger side of the oil pan will have staining and wetness to it if it's leaking, and then coming towards the back here and looking forward of the car is your bottom of your transmission, and you'll have oil staining back here as well. So mine actually looks like it could be some oil pan leaking here, and this is kind of what you're looking for. This is more of a seep and less of a leak. Not an immediate concern, but something to be aware of and know that it's going to need to be fixed in the future. Now the other oil pan leak, or other oil leak that we talked about before, would be the Vanos oil line or oil filter housing. Like I said, those are relatively hard to see from up top, and they're also difficult to see from down below if you have this pan in place, this front plastic shield in place. If you have the ability to take this plastic shield off, I'm going to point out to you where to look for those leaks on those two things. So let me get this shield off, and we'll come back and I'll point out where you can see if you have either a Vanos oil line or an oil filter housing leak when you're underneath the car. All right, so before we go underneath the car, I do want to show you guys, if you wanted to take this pan off to look for oil leaks on a car that you're looking at, it has Phillips screws here in the corners, right here. There's 2 on each side of it, on the driver's side and the passenger side, and then there's 3 along the back. Those screws are here and here, there and there on the passenger side, and then the other 3 are in this panel, in that panel along the back, right here where it meets this metal skid plate underneath the car. So once you get that off, we'll be able to see any of our oil leaks a lot easier. If you're looking for an oil filter housing or Vanos oil line leak, you're going to be looking in this general area here. This bolt right here is actually a bolt holding the power steering pump to the bottom of the oil filter housing bracket. And so that right there next to that bolt right here to the right is the actual oil filter housing itself. And then if you have an oil filter housing leak up here on the side of the engine block, you're going to see a lot of oil and wetness, and then you'll see it running down the side of the oil pan here as well. Your oil pan can also leak in this area. It's not as common, but if you are looking for an oil leak and you see oil in this area, look to see if it's above the oil pan area, and if it is, then that's an indication that it's going to be the oil filter housing and or the Vanos oil line. That's it for oil leaks on this engine. There isn't any place else that I've ever seen oil leaks from. That's why we call it the trifecta, because those are the 3 things that leak. Other things that leak underneath this car can be transmission fluid from your pan. As you can see, mine's got a little bit of a seep. This I'm not concerned about. It doesn't drip on the floor. I haven't had to top up fluid, so it's not a concern. I have seen these cars also leak from the shift shaft here for the selecting the gear that you're in. It's not very common on these cars, but I have seen it. I've also seen a few times here and there where the output shaft on these leaks, where the the drive shaft's hooked up to. That's also very rare, and I would not be looking for that if I were you. The other things that leak underneath this car are power steering lines. They leak here at the pump where they come off. There's like a rubber hose here that comes up to the reservoir up top, and then also the return line to the reservoir leaks, which is up here on this side next to the radiator, and you will see oil staining in this general area towards the front of the car. This is your radiator drain here. So if you're seeing like a oily type staining over here or leak, it's most likely going to be from those power steering lines where they go into the cooler at the front. We will go back up top and I will point those out to you, but if you're seeing oil in this area, it's from the power steering lines. The other thing I've never seen leak is these transmission cooler lines here. I've never had an issue with these. I've never had an issue with the transmission cooler, so that's not anything you really need to worry about. These cars do have issues with coolant leaks, which can also be caused by the coolant temp sensor over here in this lower radiator hose, as well as the cooling system itself. We'll go over that later on, is another area that requires service, but we're going to go over that later. I'm going to go back up top and I'm going to show you those power steering lines and where to be looking for leaks on that. All right, so back up top and still going over oil or power steering leaks. In this area right here, you're going to have your coolant reservoir and then air box, and then in front of your air box and next to your coolant reservoir, you're going to look down in this area, and right here is the power steering lines where they go into the cooler. As you can see, mine are shiny and new because they've both been replaced because they leaked on me. So you'll see wetness here at these lines where the rubber hose goes into the metal fitting here, and on both lines. And then, like I said, you'll see wetness and oil down below them, and that's an indication these power steering lines are leaking. That fluid is normally red on these cars, so it's a lot easier to kind of tell what color oil you're looking for when you're looking for a power steering leak, because it's red. As far as power steering goes, I do want to point out, you see this leaking here, this seepage here on the cap as well as the side of the power steering reservoir. That's a leak, but it's not an issue. This cap actually has a vent hole in it, and just with normal driving, it tends to vent. It's supposed to vent out pressure, but it carries some fluid with it as well. This is something that if you see this, it may be a leaking cap, but from my experience, I can put a cap on this in a week or two of driving. It'll end up being stained up here on the top, and then over time, it just works its way down. So this, not an issue. The leaks at the hoses on the bottom of the reservoir, which are the return line out of the cooler, as well as the one down to the pump, are an area of issue, as well as at the pump itself and up here at the cooler. So that's just another thing to look out for. So power steering leaks covered. We're going to move on to cooling system. All right, so the next thing we're going to go over is cooling system. There's quite a few things on the cooling system on these cars to look out for. First being the coolant reservoir area. The coolant reservoir caps can leak under pressure. There's a spring in here that's supposed to vent pressure when it gets too high, but sometimes that spring gets weak and it'll vent pressure at any pressure. It just blows off immediately and you'll have leaking. As well as the expansion tank itself, the plastic tends to degrade over time and crack and can cause splits in it, which leak as well. You'll see white staining in this general area, whether it be on that box or over here next to the box or down here along the side of the fan shroud. The upper and lower radiator hoses, these can get damaged due to power steering and or oil leaks on this side, as well as the lower radiator hose that comes off of the thermostat over here and runs down to the lower part of the radiator. That can be damaged by oil leaks from valve cover and stuff like that, so that's another thing to look out for. And also the coolant temp sensor that's down here in this lower hose. There's an O-ring on that temp sensor that I've seen leak more times than I can count. So another place to look. The thermostat and water pump on these cars needs to be replaced on a somewhat regular basis, every 60,000 to 80,000 miles. Find out if it's been replaced on yours. Keep it in the list of maintenance items to take care of. Thermostat can go bad, get stuck closed, cause an overheat issue. Water pumps are pretty notorious on these for going bad and not circulating coolant properly and causing overheat issues. So just know if those are done. If they haven't been done, make sure you get them taken care of. One thing I do want to tell you guys, I tell everyone that I ever talk to that owns these older BMWs, if you have an issue where it overheats, do not continue to drive it. These cars are really bad for getting hot, blowing head gaskets very, very easily, even with slight over temperature. And if you continue to drive it while it's overheating, they actually have a problem where they pull the threads out of the engine block for the head bolts that hold the cylinder head down. Once you do that, it's either replacement engine and or just expensive fixes for fixing the threads in the block. So if you have an issue where your car's overheating, don't try to drive it someplace. Don't try to drive it to the service facility that you take it to. Stop driving, get it towed, get it taken care of. It's going to save you a lot of money in the long run. Other than that, there's no other cooling system issues that I can go over. Next, we're going to move on to some suspension stuff that we need to look for on these cars that's relatively common. So let's get to that. All right, so if you're going to look at one of these cars to buy, if you have one already and you're trying to look it over to kind of figure out where you're at with it, getting it up on the jack and jack stands is a good thing to start with. These in the front, things you're going to be looking for is tie rod play. So you're going to shake your steering side to side like this. That'll tell you on either side if you have tie rod play. That's also an indication of control arm bushing play, or can be an indication of control arm bushing play. I will go underneath the car here shortly and point that out to you. These cars are really bad for control arm bushings wearing out, so sometimes you'll get play there, and you're going to need to double check that it's not tie rod play. The other thing would be is shaking top to bottom like this and making sure that you don't have wheel bearing play. These cars aren't really bad about wheel bearings, so it's not something that I check every car anyways, but I don't see it being an issue on most of these cars. Tie rods at higher mileage, I've already replaced one on this car. Control arm bushings being one of the higher ones. So we're going to go underneath the car. I'm going to show you control arm bushing, and then I'm going to give you kind of a general idea of how to check them if you have the ability to jack the car up, and then I'll also explain to you how to check them if you can't jack the car up while driving. All right, so underneath the driver's side of the car here, this is your tire here, obviously. This is your tie rod. That's what you were checking for play in, whether it be the outer or the inner here when you're shaking side to side. The other thing that you're checking for when you're shaking the tire side to side is for play in the control arm bushing that's back here. So this is at the back of the front wheel well area, like past the skid plate underneath the car. That bushing, you can check for cracking in it, but not always are you going to see cracking, but that bushing itself could actually be worn. The rubber gets worn out over time and doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Now, one way that you can check these is to come towards the front of the car here. If you're able to jack it up and take a hammer, and you can actually hit the front edge of the tire and see if that bushing is bad, because you're pushing load into the tire towards the back of the car. By hitting it, you'll see that bushing wiggle back there. The arm will actually wiggle inside the bushing where it's attached to it, and that's an indication that the bushing itself is worn out. A little bit of play is not a big deal. A lot of bit of play is an issue. It can cause a lot of tire wear issues, as well as just uncomfortable feeling while you're driving the car. The other way that I can explain to you guys how to check these is if you are driving the car, you can feel that control arm bushing being bad in the car when you hit the brakes or jab the brakes really fast. Driving down the road 10, 15 miles an hour, if you jab the brakes really fast, you'll feel like a knocking noise in the front end, or feel like a clunk underneath the floorboard. That's an indication that the control arm bushing is bad. The other way that you can check visually from outside the car is have somebody drive it and jab the brake pedal at 5 or 6 miles an hour or rolling through a parking lot, and you'll actually see this whole tire kick backwards in the wheel well when you hit the brakes, and that's because that bushing is worn out and causing the tire to move forward and backward in the wheel well. So that's one thing to look out for in these cars, because it's actually pretty common. Other than that, no other real issues on the front suspension. Obviously check, for leaks of your struts, check for worn sway bar end links, but not all of those are super common on these. Tie rods and control arm bushings would be the two things to be looking out for. So we're going to move on to the rear and checking the rear suspension. All right, so here in the back of the car, not a whole lot goes wrong with the suspension on these. You'll have some control arm bushing issues here and there, but not crazy common. It all depends on driving and stuff like that. Way you would check things, no different than the front, is to shake wheels side to side, top to bottom, feel for any play, and then try to figure out what control arm itself has play in it. Like I said, there's not a whole lot back here that goes wrong. One thing these are notorious for and a lot of them have been fixed to this point. Not all of them. Is these cars had issues where the rear subframe where it mounts to the body would actually cause the metal to tear / crack where the bolts go into the body. There's a service bulletin on it. There's a lot of information on the internet. I will link stuff down below in the description for you guys to watch. It was more of a common issue on manual cars because the drivetrain shock of shifting gears and letting the clutch out put a lot of stress on the body of these cars. So if you're looking at an automatic one of these, it's usually not a problem. Mine doesn't have any issues. I do plan on putting the reinforcement brackets in just because of the way I drive. If you are a spirited driver, I would consider it being one of those things you need to keep on your list of things to do. But like I said, I don't have any issues, so I can't really show you guys. I'll put some pictures up of what they look like when they're cracked, as well as links and videos down below of some of the issues. But other than that, not a whole lot of stuff here in the rear of these cars. Shocks go bad. They usually don't leak. It's more of a feel thing that you can tell when you're driving the car that they're worn out, but I can't really show you guys that. Other than that, not much else. Suspension or anything like that. Obviously check your brakes and stuff like that to make sure everything's okay with that. So let's head back up front and round things out. All right, so I've gone over pretty much everything I can think to go over that's a quick visual that you guys can check out if you're looking at buying one of these. These cars, like most cars, have issues where you have a check engine light or an ABS light or anything like that. Because there's so much stuff to go over for those issues, I'm not going to go over it. Stuff I wanted to go over is just the stuff you can check real quick. You're going after work to go check out a car that you want to buy. These are things that you can just kind of like visually check and know what to be looking for if you're looking to purchase one. There are videos on my channel about some of the other issues these cars have, like crankcase vent valves, or there's also the interior trim on these cars has, just with age, tends to fall apart. So there's videos going over how to fix some of that stuff as well. If you guys have any other questions, please comment down below. We're sure to answer any questions you guys have. These cars are, to me, great to own. They're one of the better driving vehicles on the market. Even compared to most newer cars, they're fantastic cars. They get decent gas mileage, you know, high 19s, low 20s on my automatic wagon, depending on how I drive it. I've seen manual wagons and sedans get 30 plus if you drive them, you know, if you're light on them. So they get decent gas mileage for what they are. They offer a very rewarding driving experience. If you're going to work on them yourself, the parts have gotten to the point now where they're relatively affordable and the repairs are not that difficult. So if you guys have any questions about this video or any others or anything that you need to do on one of these cars, please comment on this video or any of my other ones. I will answer any questions you guys have. Other than that, we're all done with this little buyer's guide, and I'll see you guys later.